Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our Dipping into the 2020 Data presentation. It is now 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but I can see that we still have a few people rolling in, so we'll give it another couple minutes before we actually begin. So plan on starting at 1:02. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Dipping into the 2020 Data with Implan. The 2020 data year is now available in the Implan application. As you can imagine, this data year is going to have some unique caveats that will reflect the state of the national economy during a global pandemic. In this presentation, we're going to cover some of the weirdness that is evident in this new data set, why that weirdness is there, and considerations for using it in your economic impact studies. We're even going to dig into the hospitality sector as an example to see how their unique challenges can be seen in this data. So quickly, I am Michael Neely. I'm the education support specialist here on the education services team at Implan, and joining me are some of the big guns here on our team to lead our presentation. Dr. Candy Klaus, who is the Director of Customer Success and Education Services, as well as Dr. Jenny Thorvaldsen, who is the Chief Economist and Director of Data Development for Implan. During this presentation, if you have a question about anything that we've presented, just make sure that you have your control panel open by hitting that orange arrow. And then from there, utilize the question box functionality to pose your question. At the conclusion of the presentation, our presenters are going to do their very best to answer as many questions as possible. But remember, if we do not get to answer yours within our allotted time frame, that we're definitely planning on getting back to you personally. Also note that this presentation is being recorded, so if you want to revisit it later, the video will be posted on our support site as soon as we can get it up there. And without further ado, I will go ahead and pass the mic off to Jenny so she can kick us off. Jenny?
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. I'd like to begin by mentioning that for those of you who may not be super familiar with Implan, the Implan produces data on an annual basis, making use of the most recently available government data and thereby reflecting year-to-year changes in the economy. And we use raw data from a variety of government agencies and programs for various geographic levels, ranging from zip codes to counties to states and the US as a whole. And while we've been doing these data releases for over 30 years, we do make some changes and updates every year, be it due to changes in our raw data sources or a new raw data source is available to us, or we make improvements to our methodologies over time as we learn new things. So there are annual changes to the data, and because of this, we put out on our website and release notes, documents that accompany each new data set. And so those entail or detail some of the changes in the raw data. And so I'm going to talk about those today. I'm going to begin by talking about some of the changes to the raw data. First, some of the changes that have nothing to do with the pandemic, and then a couple of changes that are very specific to the pandemic. I'll then take a peek at some of the 2020 in-plan data at the US level to show how the changes that took place in the US economy in 2020 are reflected in the 2020 in-plan data. Then I'll pass it off to Candy, who'll go into a more local example, and then some very important considerations in terms of using the 2020 data for impact analyses and contribution analyses. Okay, Candy. Thank you. So I'll begin with the non-pandemic related changes to the data. I want to mention that you all know that the 2020 decennial census happened last year, and well, I guess in 2020, and we were able to incorporate some of the new data. Now, by the time we needed the data from what we used from the census, not all of the decennial census was out yet. So we were able to use some of the population data for at the national level, the state level, and for our Puerto Rican data set. By the time we needed the data, the county level data weren't out yet, and we also use the Census Bureau's data for household counts, and the new decennial census data for those were not out yet either. So we just used our regular normal annual data procedures for those pieces, and that involves still data from the Census Bureau, but it's survey data rather than data from that decennial census. So next year we will be incorporating, in next year's in-plan data, we'll be incorporating the rest of that decennial census data, assuming it will all be out at that point. Also, sometimes we get new counties, we lose counties, counties change their names or their FIPS codes, and we had such a case this year. The Valdez-Cordova census area in Alaska was split to form two new counties, the Chugach census area and the Copper River census area. So the 2020 data will have those new counties in there. All right. Okay, now we're going to turn to some of the pandemic related changes to our raw data that we use. So you all are aware that there was some stimulus to businesses related to the pandemic. There was the Paycheck Protection Program. And so those were loans to businesses, but the idea was that most businesses would not have to pay those back. So while technically loans, they were treated as a subsidy by the BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis, from which we get a lot of our data. And because they're treated as a subsidy, they show up in the BEA data as a reduction in TOPI and an increase in OPI. So just without going too deep, just to give you a quick overview, TOPI is taxes on production and imports net of subsidies. So because it is net of subsidies, that's why when an industry receives a subsidy, you'll see a reduction in TOPI. And TOPI can actually turn negative if there's more subsidies than taxes paid. And then an increase in OPI, which is other property income, which is basically corporate profits and depreciation, but the bulk of it is corporate profits. Okay, and so in the NEPAs, the PPP loans to businesses that are forgiven are classified as a subsidy, as I mentioned, but if for any reason a loan had to be repaid, then it is treated as a loan, and it will be treated in the NEPA data and the BEA data just as all loans would be. And so it would just be treated normally like that. And I'm sorry I used the word NEPA, and some of you may not be familiar with that. That's the National Income and Product Accounts. It's a lot of data that we use also from the BEA. Now, just to point out that there are some industries that receive subsidies on an annual basis. Think like some agricultural sectors, public transportation sectors, things like that. They'll see subsidies each year. And so those are, just to mention that those are still in effect and those are in the data as well. It's just that this PPP program added additional subsidies to some industries and new subsidies to some industries. Okay. Households also received stimulus. Some households received stimulus payments as part of the CARES Act, and there were also temporary increased federal unemployment benefits for those who are not able to find work. And both of these programs aimed to encourage household spending. And these changes in household spending are reflected in the BEA's personal consumption expenditures data, PCE data, for 2020, and those data are incorporated into the 2020 in-plan data. So in in-plan, you'll see this reflected. Now, some of this money was spent and some of it was saved. You might have heard news reports about savings rates just exploding in 2020, and in fact, the latest edition of The Economist magazine had an article just about that. And indeed, you'll see that in plan, you'll see that reflected. And you'll also see changes not only in the amount that households spent, but shifts in what they spent their money on. And we're going to look at, for example, more on grocery stores and less on restaurants. And Candy is going to showcase this later when she shows her examples. Also just wanted to mention that these increased savings rates are reflected in in-plan, and they will affect economic impact results with generally lower induced effects, all else equal. So something to keep in mind. All right, well, let's now turn to looking at the 2020 economy reflected in in-plan. So I'm going to be looking at the US level. So I'm looking at the national data, and I'm just going to highlight a few of these changes that really are intuitive, and you'll see them reflected in in-plan and show you that, and show you a few of the different types of changes and that you can find in in-plan. And then Candy will look at some more specific examples. Okay, so let's start with looking at changes in employment. There was a shift from wage and salary employment to proprietor employment. The US as a whole saw a loss of wage and salary employment and an increase in proprietors. Now, so proprietors, you probably heard some things in the news about new businesses popping up and people starting to work for themselves, and startups and things like that, as folks either lost their wage and salary job or voluntarily quit it. And so we do see that shift reflected in in-plan. Now, do keep in mind that not every industry experienced a loss in wage and salary employment, and we're going to see that in the next slide when we get there. Also keep in mind that these changes vary by region. Not all states saw an increase in proprietors, with Alaska and West Virginia actually experiencing a net loss of around 2.5% of proprietors. And this is largely due to those states having a lot of mining activity and farming activity in the case of West Virginia. And both of those are very proprietor heavy sectors. So just when those sectors experience any kind of loss, you're going to see a large loss in proprietors because those are very proprietor heavy sectors. Now, this doesn't mean that those two states didn't have increases in proprietors in some sectors, just that the loss in some sectors outweighed the gains in other sectors. Now, I do want to mention here that employment counts themselves do not provide any insight into the hours worked. We do know that some folks may have kept their job but had their hours reduced. And in other cases, even the opposite happened. If, with loss of a lot of jobs, those who remained working may have been working a lot of extra hours. And so I just wanted to point out that looking at wages data can provide some insight into hours worked by these employees. and looking at the occupational data that we have at InPlan, which includes estimates of hours worked, would also provide some insight into that topic. All right, so let's just look at a specific example at the US level of changes in retail. What I just wanted to point out here is you can see that the majority of retail sectors saw a loss in wage and salary employment between 2019 and 2020. Not surprising, as people were not out shopping as much for quarantine reasons and various other reasons. We talked about households being a little concerned about spending money during this time as well, because economic security was a little iffy. So no surprise there, but wanted to point out, if you can see that I've highlighted a few in yellow here, that some retail sectors actually experienced an increase in employment, and though they're actually pretty intuitive. You probably heard stories about people renovating their homes and doing home improvement projects and things like that just to keep themselves busy and things like that. So building material and garden equipment stores actually saw quite an increase in employment. And food and beverage stores, of course, these are your grocery stores and your liquor stores. And as we were all eating and drinking more at home than at restaurants, this makes sense that they would see an increase in employment. And then finally, of course, we've got our non-store retailers, which is where the bulk of online shopping is going to show up. So very intuitive stuff here, but just wanted to kind of showcase that the changes are reflected in InPlan data, and also that they really do vary by industry and by region. A couple other things that might be interesting to look at: international trade. We've heard about exports shutting down to cut back on the transmission of the virus. Certain countries didn't want to trade as much and things like that. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development had a report that there were huge declines in international trade in 2020. So just wanted to show, yep, this is also reflected in InPlan. We see about a 16% drop in foreign exports and about 11% drop in foreign imports. Now, these are dollar values, not physical units of things. And also want to mention that in InPlan, we have data on the international trade, not only of goods, like shippable goods, shippable commodities, but also on services. So these numbers may be a little different than what you would see in most reports, because most reports, there aren't a lot of data sources for the trade and services, actually. So wanted to point that out. Also want to point that out that in InPlan, you can go in and look at the commodity detail as well to see which commodities fell the most, commodities and services fell the most in terms of foreign exports and foreign imports. So this is just an overview. All right, what else could we look at that might have changed between these 2 years? We already mentioned changes in household spending. Candy's going to look at kind of the shifts in what households spent on. Here I'm just showing you that at the US level, the overall values, and indeed there was about a 3.5% reduction in total household spending. Now, during that time period, there was actually an increase in the number of households in the US. So it actually makes more sense to look at household spending per household. And when you do that, you actually see about a 5% reduction in household spending per household. And the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City reported that consumer spending declined and shifted in response to the pandemic. So not only did consumer spending fall, but what we're spending money on also changed. And Candy will give more insight into that later. What else could be of interest? Definitely population shifts. You know, as folks were able to, some folks were able to work from home, they might have moved to a different location or a second home or thing like that. And that's reflected in InPlan. For example, you'll see higher percentage population growth in the Rocky Mountain West, in Texas, South Carolina, Delaware, Florida. And there's actually a little bit of a population decrease in some states. And you can see that in InPlan. I wanted to point out there may be some interest in changing commuting patterns for similar reasons. People are changing where they live and working from home more and things like that. I wanted to point out that the raw data that gives us counts on people working in one county and living in a different county. It's called our journey to work data. It only comes out every few years, and we did not get new journey to work data when we were processing the 2020 in-plan data. However, the movement of employee compensation, basically employee earnings, among counties will reflect shifts in employment and earnings at the county level. So there will be some change due to that, but not due to new journey to work data. Some folks will be interested in wages per worker. Just a note of caution there, and something that might not be intuitive. Some of you may have heard and seen reports that wages per worker actually increased in 2020, which was not intuitive and very surprising to some folks. But when you think about it a little deeper, it makes sense. It's not that folks received raises in 2020, it's that at a higher percentage of the jobs that were lost were lower hours, lower wage earning jobs. So the jobs that remained were higher earning jobs, and that lifted the average wages per worker. So just a note of caution there if that's something that you're looking into. Also, there, of course, nowadays, the topic of inflation is very popular and important, and all that to talk about, and just wanted you to know that the Bureau of Labor Statistics Employment Projections Program puts out inflation rates and each year, and we incorporate those into the in-plan data. So we do have updated, in in-plan they're called deflators, but of course it's deflation or inflation depending whether it's less than one or greater than one, two sides of the same coin. But so we do have updated deflators in in-plan that take into account that updated BLS data on inflation. Okay. I will now hand it over to Candy to go into some more local examples and some important considerations in terms of using the 2020 in-plan data for analyses.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Now that we've seen some of that US data and some of those big picture considerations, let's dig into the scene in New York City. We can head into the region details section in in-plan and look at all sorts of interesting pieces of data. So again, looking at the New York City metropolitan statistical area, we see overall employment changes, a 10% decrease in our wage and salary employment and a 3% increase in proprietor employment. So not only were New Yorkers staying home, but tourism in the Big Apple also pretty much halted. We can look at the industry side too. The overall economy of New York City lost $52.6 billion in output between 2019 and 2020. But again, as Jenny pointed out, we see that grocery stores actually saw an increase of about 1.2 billion. And restaurants saw a difference of a negative 11.4 billion. So it's $11.4 billion in losses to full service restaurants between 2019 and 2020. Remember, when we're looking at output for retailers and wholesalers, it's going to be equal to the gross margin, not the gross sales. So it's going to reflect the value of the service they provide, not the items they're actually selling. We can look at those same industries from the side of what households were spending their money on. So this is how households in the New York City MSA actually spent their money. Grocery stores, again, 2019 spending, we had 14 billion, up a whole $1 billion in 2020. Restaurant spending plummeted by about $7 billion between the 2 years. Okay, overall spending of $52 billion of lost change between those 2 years. Another thing we can dig into is the spending by households on specific commodities. So here we have household spending on beer, right? A lot of people were choosing to drink at home as opposed to going to our restaurants and bars. We saw that. But what about that consumption at home? So this is showing the spending by household income group on the commodity for beer, ale, malt liquor, and non-alcoholic beer. So overall, beer purchasing by households was down 6% between the 2 years. This table is also showing us that folks at the highest earning levels actually increased their spending on beer between 19 and 20, while everyone else earning less than $150,000 per household decreased their spending on beer. One of the questions that we get all the time, which I believe has actually come in as a question already, is, so when do we use the 2019 data versus the 2020 data? Well, the answer is quite simply, it depends. If you want to look at events that happened in 2020, by all means, use the 2020 data year. Also, if you want to look at industry contribution analysis using the 2020 data year, that's a great way to gain insights into the COVID economy. Run your analysis of 100% contribution of your industry of interest and see the effects that are supported by that industry during that pandemic year. When using the 2020 data year, you always want to add as much information as possible to your event in the advanced menu. This process is even easier now with the addition of that new event type in IMPLAN, the Industry Impact Analysis Event Detailed, what we like to call IIA. With the Industry Impact Analysis Event type, you can specify any value in the industry's Leontief production function as your event values. You can even customize the spending pattern within that event type. This is especially useful when you want to examine the effect of a business in 2020 because we know it was such a crazy year. Whenever you're using the 2020 data, do consider adding a footnote to your report or presentation that notes that you use that 2020 data set and a disclaimer about what caveats there might be within that, noting that this was hopefully the worst of the pandemic. So in general, IMPLAN always is going to recommend using the data year that looks most like the year you want to analyze. Because of the uniqueness of that 2020 data year in IMPLAN, it is very possible that this data does not at all reflect the economic conditions that you're trying to model. So you want to keep that in mind when deciding whether or not to use the 2020 and maybe consider using that 2019 data. Using the 2019 IMPLAN data set might be the best option if you're trying to model a change before the pandemic or anything occurring after 2020. My personal favorite, however, is to use both. You can run an analysis in the 2019 data, run it in the 2020 data, and show the potential range of economic impacts. Running your analysis in these 2 years, maybe you could take an average of the two, will show an economy that's something in between what we knew as the normal in 2019 and what was the chaotic 2020. So let's look at the impact of a couple of industries in the New York City MSA and how they fared during the pandemic. What I did here was I took 2 industries, retail, food and beverage, and full service restaurants. What we know, the economy isn't going to look like 2019 again, at least in the short term. We also know that 21 and 22 so far aren't nearly as bad as 2020 was. So what we think the true economic picture for running an impact in 21 or 22 is going to look like, it's going to lie somewhere between the 2019 and 2020 data sets. So here I used an industry contribution analysis to analyze the contribution of these industries in both the 2019 and 2020 data years. So let's pop into IMPLAN and see how I set this up. So on our impact screen, I simply have 2 events here, both industry contribution analysis, one for our retailers and one for our restaurants, both set at a value of 100%. On the right, I have 2 groups, the same New York City MSA in both of the groups. On the top, I have data year 2019. On the bottom, I have data year 2020. The only difference between these 2 is the data year. I'm going to look at my impacts as if they are happening in 2022 for both. And then I'm going to look at my results in terms of 2022 dollars as well. So I can compare those 2 apples to apples. Okay, so I simply grab these 2 events and pop them over into my 2 groups, and then I can run my analysis. In this case, I've already run it, so I can pop over and I'll grab my results. I put these into a table here, so it's very easy for us to view. Our 2019 contribution shows 730,547 employees supported by these 2 industries, with about $87 billion in output. Looking at our 2020 results, we see only 557,729 employees supported, with only 67 billion in output. So as I mentioned, what I like to do is look at these as that range, somewhere between 19 and 20, or the average, simply taking an average of those 2 years. So in this case, I would say supported approximately 644,000 jobs and $77 billion in total output. We aren't seeing those higher values that we saw in the 2019 data, but we aren't seeing the super low values from 2020 either. It's sort of a chirpy compromise to estimate the current state of the economy. So a few final thoughts as we wrap up today's presentation and open things up for questions. Our goal at InPlan is always to publish data that are as accurate and reasonable as possible. Therefore, InPlan data are not adjusted to be smooth over time. You're going to see those giant blips in the data as things in the economy shift and change. With that in mind, there's some things to remember when we look at the household spending. Reiterating things that Jenny talked about right at the beginning, there were changes in the household spending and savings rate, which reflected what households did with that stimulus money and unemployment benefits. Changes in the relative amounts that households spent among various commodities is captured in the 2020 data, as households spent about 4% less across the US. Those gains in household income from the stimulus and unemployment benefits are accounted for in the relationship of spending per dollar of new income. But remember, InPlan's not going to assume that households receive more payments from these sources in any analysis that you run. Government payments are not by default internalized in the InPlan multipliers. So if you want to look at any of those gains in household income, you can utilize a household income event in the model and use the specific commodity purchases as events. Remember too that even with the fiscal efforts to support household spending and encourage the economy to rebound, there were those exceptionally high personal savings rates in 2020 as people spent less money due to being stuck in quarantine, concerns over economic security and job losses. So those increased savings rates will be applied to income that's analyzed in InPlan. So all else equal, this is going to lead to lower induced effects. Looking at the industry side, we know that some industries lost while some industries gained. While we didn't go into our furniture stores, we did a lot more online shopping. Remember everybody running out of toilet paper? 2020 was a weird year that we're likely going to be footnoting for years to come. Many industries shut down, even temporarily, decreased workforces. Some pivoted their entire business model. Many spent less on overall intermediate inputs, and some saw international and even domestic markets dry up. Cities and states also followed very different paths in terms of issuing and enforcing stay-at-home orders. Places with stricter regulations saw less folks out. Therefore, many non-essential retailers were really very hard hit. Also, many businesses took advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program, that PPP. These loans show up in InPlan as reductions in taxes on production and imports, or what we like to call TOPI, and that's offset by the gains in OPI, other property income. You'll see that many industries have negative TOPI when you look at the industry details, and this is going to show up as negative tax results. If we look at just an example of doctor's offices in 2020 in New York City, they had $34 billion in output, but negative taxes. So what I ran here is a contribution analysis of offices of physicians in New York City for 2020. And you can see while we do have positives across the board for our general economic indicators, we have negative tax results at our sub-county general, which is our city township tax in the direct, our sub-county special district, which are our police and fire districts, county, and state. So only the federal government had a positive, but all told, we have a negative, a much lower total tax impact than we would expect to see. If you want to correct for this kind of behavior using the 2020 data, you can customize your region using that feature on our map region screen, or consider again using that new industry impact analysis event type. and entering all the known values of the production function. Remember also that there were noticeable shifts from the wage and salary employment to proprietor employment. Many folks took the opportunity to go out on their own as part of that great resignation that we're still experiencing. We saw that drop in foreign imports and exports. And finally, one thing to remember is that not every change observed between prior data years and the 2020 data year are because of the pandemic. Other changes to consider: general commuting, population shifts, increases, that inflation, and changes in consumer behavior and preferences. 2020 was also a banner year for the economy as many polluting industries shut down and commuting halted. So generally speaking, when you look at the economic impacts and the associated environmental impacts in IMPLAN, you'll see lower output in terms of not only dollars, but the emissions that you'll find on the environmental results tab. So with all of that, please do remember that we have a wealth of information available to you 24/7 on our support site at support.implan.com. The release notes and all the information and caveats with using the 2020 data set are available. And we also have some other articles that could help you analyzing the economic impacts of the coronavirus and some additional considerations with that. And if you don't already have access to the 2020 data in the IMPLAN application, you can schedule a demo by visiting implan.com/demo. On a demo, our team can show you all the data inside the application, run through an analysis specific to your interests, and show you all of the results populated by IMPLAN. So again, to schedule yours today, visit implan.com/demo. Thank you so much for your attention today. I'm now going to pass control back to Michael, who's been monitoring the questions for us, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Candy and Jenny, for that wonderful presentation on our 2020 data. So I just wanted to mention quickly for those that may have missed it at the beginning of our presentation, that if you have a question, make sure that you open your control panel by hitting that highlighted orange arrow in this graphic, and utilizing the question box to type your question. And now we're going to pose some of these questions that have come in to our economists, Dr. Jenny Thorvaldsen and Dr. Candy Klaus. If we don't get the chance to answer yours live, do not be discouraged. The team will get an answer for each question that has come through after the webinar. So with that, we can go ahead and jump into those. So one of the first questions that came in was, where do I find household spending data for my region in IMPLAN? Candy, do you care to elaborate?
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to pop out of this presentation and pop back into IMPLAN. This is super easy to find. If you pop to your region screen, choose whatever geography you want to examine. First of all, I'm going to choose my data year as 2020. And then, for example, if I wanted to be in the New York City MSA again, I'm going to grab that. It'll populate on the right. And then I'm going to grab our region details icon. This is where you will find all of the data you ever wanted to know. And back in here, I can head into industry accounts, then reports, then household industry demand. This is going to show me my different household levels. Those earning between 0 and 15K, 15 to 30, etc., all the way up. And they're spending across industries here.
Great, thanks for that, Candy. Another question that came in is, can I look at the data over a longer time period than 2019 or 2020?
Ah, yes, and that's actually very fun to do. Again, I can pop back to my IMPLAN home screen. In this case, I'm going to pop into Data Library. Anytime you want to look at things over time, Data Library is going to be the place where we have all the data going back to 2001 available for you to examine. So a few different places you can check out the data. The first would be our dashboard and come to industry compare if I want to look across industries. Again, a wealth of other information available in here too. This is going to default to showing 2001 to 2020. What do we have? Employee compensation for the state of North Carolina. So you'll get a trend line, and then overall, we have employee compensation values down here. So if I wanted to change that and look at something like output or total employment, and maybe I wanted to look at both North and South Carolina, for example, I can just change my filters just like I'm used to seeing on the other side of the application and click that refresh button. I'll get then 2 lines over here on my year over year, and you'll get to see that North Carolina is a little bit bigger than South Carolina. My map will shift, and I will get an updated table at the bottom as well.
And Candy, I can hop in and mention something if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So Candy very correctly stated earlier that in-plan data from one year to the next is not meant to be time series data, and it will show you we don't smooth anything out or anything like that, but I will mention that here in data library, when we're going back, these data from 2001 up to 2020 have been, the earlier data years have been rerun using our more recent methodologies and data sources, and with the all in this current sectoring scheme. So every time we get a new in-plan sectoring scheme, which happens about every 5 years, due to the BEA publishing a new set of benchmark tables, we do go back and re-estimate 2001 up to the current data year, using the new, getting everything into the new sectoring scheme and using our current best practices and data sources.
Awesome.
These
Thank
are
you.
a little bit more of a time series.
Yes, that is correct. Everything you're going to find is also in that 546 industry scheme here. If you want to use the 536, the last industry scheme before the current, you do have that option available on the input-output side of in-plan as well. The other place you can look while you're in data library, if you want to create your own view, something specific, is coming into the Explore. Again, I'm going to pop into industry data, and this is going to allow me to pick and choose exactly what measures I want to look at, what filters I want to use, and what kind of visualizations I'm going to get. So a lot of opportunities to dig into this data, again, going back to that 2001 data year.
Awesome, Candy. Thanks for that quick data library demonstration. The next question that we had come in was, what is the difference between the 2020 annual data set and the COVID Q2 and Q3 data sets?
Yes, good one. You want to take this, Jenny?
Yeah, very good question. So when the pandemic hit and folks were, so in the middle of 2020, folks were concerned about using the 2019 data because the economy was changing so drastically, so quickly, so much that some folks were hoping for something that reflected what was going on. And so at that point, we decided to develop a quarterly data product that used some quarterly data and as well as a lot of projections. And so we created that to give folks, I guess, a little bit, some in-plan data that were more reflective of what was going on currently. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, I would just add in, now that we have that full 2020 data set, there's really no need to be using the quarterly data set anymore.
Yes, and I will, thank you for mentioning that, Candy, and I will also say those quarterly data sets, we provided a few of those. They do represent annual data, but it's as if the whole year looked like that quarter. So you don't, it's not really ideal to use any of those quarterly data sets to run some sort of impact that is meant to look like 2020 as a whole year, because exactly what Candy said, now not only do we have the full picture of the entire year of 2020, so we want to look at the whole year instead of just one quarter as if that quarter were a year, but also we didn't, with our annual data, we don't have to do much projection. The data reflect what actually happened. Whereas with that quarterly data, there's the data sets that we use for that are much less detailed and much more projected. There's less real data in there. Although there is some real data in there, like quarterly GDP and things like that, but industry specific and very region specific, a lot less so. So they're not ideal for that.
All right, so the next question we had come in was about Paytech protection program. So to confirm, PPP is not included in total worker compensation?
That's right. But basically it could be, in the sense that if the PPP loan allowed an industry or business to stay open and pay its workers, then in that sense, that PPP loan allowed that EC to not fall, right? But where the BEA classifies those PPP dollars is not in EC. So even though it can influence EC, those dollars don't go straight into the EC data.
Right, and in general, in plan, those dollars were treated as subsidies for industries, so you're going to really see those show up as reduction in taxes on production and imports.
Yes, and so you may see in a lot of cases some negative tax impact results related to that exact thing, because TOPI can turn negative for some industries if they were highly subsidized.
Okay, another question that came in was regarding whether or not we'll have this information written up somewhere for future use, because I am sure I will not remember all of this. Naturally so, there was a lot of information covered here, but fear not, on that same landing page on our support site where you registered for this presentation, you here soon, as soon as we can get the video processed, we will update that page from a registration page to just a landing page with the recording of today's session. And as you can see, Candy just walked you through quickly how to get to that. And if you check the chat box, I will be placing a direct link to that page there. So be checking this page in the coming hours for the recording of this presentation. So another question that came in was regarding the number of households. And the question is, why did the number of households rise?
Oh, sure, I can take this one. So the number of households often rises, usually from year to year. It generally increases in the US because the population of the US is generally increasing. And we did see that between 2019 and 2020, the population of the US did increase, as well as the household count. Now, I do see that the number of households increased at a slightly higher rate than the population. So the household size actually fell just a little bit. And that's just basically the average number of persons per household. It was 2.63 in 2019, and it's 2.61 in 2020. So I'd have to dig deeper to know the actual economic reasons behind that, but those shifts in household size over time do happen.
Michael, do we have any other questions that came in?
Yes, so one that just came in is regarding non-store retail. And they would like to know, is there any way to drill down further into the data relative to household spending?
Hello?
I'm sorry, were you not able to hear me?
No,
Can you
I
repeat
got
the
dropped off for a
question?
second.
Apologies. So another question would be, so employment counts are head counts independent of hours worked rather than full-time employments, and also are proprietors counted as employees?
I could grab this one if you don't mind, Candy.
Go right ahead.
All right, so yes, in InPlan, the employment counts, and this is the same definition that's used by Bureau of Labor Statistics and Bureau of Economic Analysis. Employment is basically a head count. It doesn't say anything of part-time versus full-time. Couple things to note about that. We do have a conversion ratios by industry if you wanted to convert InPlan numbers into full-time equivalents, or if you have a full-time equivalent number and you need to convert it to a head count number to put into InPlan to set up your analysis, you can do it in the opposite direction as well. So we have those conversion ratios by industry if you need those. Also wanted to mention though that they are seasonally adjusted. So for example, in our if a person was employed for 1/4 of the year, they'll show up in the raw data set as 0.25 of a job. So they are seasonally adjusted in that way when we get the annual data. And they're just not, there isn't information on hours. Now, some of those employees, so we have two types of employment in InPlan. We have wage and salary employment, and we have proprietors. Those wage and salary employment numbers, those folks can work for the proprietors or for a corporation. So, but the proprietors themselves are going to show up in that proprietor count. Okay, so the proprietors are in the proprietor count, but anyone they employ as like a W-2 employee, they're going to show up in the wage and salary employment category.
All right, and I think I got the last question that came in regarding non-store retail. Is there any way to drill down further into the data relative to household spending? I'm going to guess that that question is looking at specifically what the spending was on, and that we can easily do in InPlan. Coming in again to our region screen, picking whatever region you want to examine. So here I'm going to look at North Carolina 2019. I could also go ahead and grab North Carolina 2020 at the same time. Popping in to region details. And again, I can come into my industry accounts, reports, household industry demand. This is going to show the commodity purchasing. So what we were buying in 2020 as households, again, this being North Carolina. And I could compare this to 2019 if I wanted to see changes across those. With any of these tables, anytime you have a table show up in InPlan, in the upper right, you'll see those ellipses show up. This will allow you to download the data into Excel. So this is again going to show us all of the industries where households are purchasing that money. There is all sorts of data back here. So if this is not what you are looking for, we also do have a great support site article. If you come to support.inplan.com, you can come into digging into the data. And then this section, brand new article called Unlock the Black Box, what we can find in region details. This is going to go over all the different things you can find in region details and some of the questions that are answered in different sections as well. So if I didn't quite hit the nail on the head with what you were looking for, pop in here. And if not, you can always email support@mplan.com with any of your questions as well. I see that we've gotten a couple questions about getting negative taxes using that 2020 in-plan data. This is a super nuanced thing, and you will see that in certain industries. Again, we're seeing that TOPI is where all the PPP money show up. But again, because this is so nuanced, if you want to look at something specific, if you have the question already posted here, we'll follow up with you. If you haven't posted a question, but you do want to ask something about this, again, please email support@mplan.com with your scenario, and we will get back to you.
All right. Well, with that, I know we still have a few of these pretty in-depth questions left that we definitely want to get to, but we also want to take a little bit of time to make sure we provide meaningful answers for those. So be looking out for us to reach out to you to get specific answers to whatever question you had asked today. Again, do not worry. If you asked a question, we will provide you with an answer. And with that, I just would like to take this time to thank everybody for joining us on this webinar and to thank our presenters, Candy and Jenny.
Thank you all so much. And again, any questions that we didn't answer live, we will have one of us or someone follow up with you within the week. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Michael and Candy.